Welcome back to Indyfest 2022. Everyone in the studio here, we have a great audience here today. A lot of familiar faces and some new ones. So go ahead and take your seats. If you're watching virtually, I hope you're enjoying it. Tell your friends. Don't forget tomorrow the gubernatorial debate at 10 o'clock, and then we're going to release some poll results. And so you want to get everybody signed up for that as well. I am really happy about being able to do the next panel, which, as Elizabeth mentioned, we had the tape a couple days ago because one of the participants couldn't be here, but I don't think people really either understand ranked choice voting or understand the impact of what that would do to Nevada elections and the kind of dramatic change that it would be. And we couldn't have found two better people than Bradley Schrager and Todd Bice to talk to Elizabeth and myself about it. So enjoy this. Welcome to a panel that I'm really excited about here at Indyfest on a question that's very important, could dramatically change the way Nevadans go to the polls if it passes twice. It's a constitutional amendment about ranked choice voting and open primaries. I'm here with the editor of the Independent, Elizabeth Thompson, to ask questions of two of my favorite lawyers in Nevada. I hope that doesn't ruin their reputations. Todd Bice is the head of what's known as the Yes on 3 committee, and Bradley Schrager is a well-known elections attorney who has some strong feelings against this. What is ranked choice voting? What are open primaries? Luckily, our own Joey Lovato has prepared a great explainer.
A ballot initiative proposing a major overhaul of elections in Nevada is going before voters this November. But what is ranked choice voting? Currently, Nevada has closed primaries and what's called first past the post voting. A closed primary means that for big partisan races, only registered Democrats can choose which Democratic candidate they want in the general election. And only registered Republicans choose which Republican they want. Minor party members and registered nonpartisans don't participate at all in this process. And first past the post voting means whichever candidate gets the most votes, even if it's less than 50% of the total votes, is declared the winner. The proposed changes would make the primary elections open to all. And in general elections, instead of voting for a single candidate, you would rank your preferences from first to fifth. This system is called Final Five voting and is the brainchild of author and philanthropist Katherine Gehl. Here's how it works. In the primary, instead of selecting from just their party's candidates, voters would pick a single candidate from a list of everyone in the race, regardless of party. Minority party members and nonpartisans would also cast votes for these races. The top 5 vote getters then go on to the general election, hence the name Final Five. The general election would have big changes as well. Instead of voting for just one candidate for each office, voters could rank their preference from first to last. So a vote would look something like this, with voters ranking each candidate in order from the one that they like the most all the way down to the one that they like the least. After the election, if any candidate has more than 50% of the first choice votes, they are automatically the winner. But if there is no clear majority, the candidate who got the fewest first choice votes would be eliminated. And their votes would go to whoever those voters ranked second. After the first elimination, if a candidate with a clear majority emerges, they are the winner. But if all candidates are still under the 50% threshold, the elimination process continues. Until someone has a clear majority and is declared the winner. Proponents say this system would give Nevada's growing number of voters not affiliated with a major party more of a voice in the political process. However, the initiative faces staunch opposition from top Democrats who say it is too confusing. If the initiative passes this November and again in 2024, the first round of ranked choice voting would happen in the 2026 election. For more on this initiative and everything else you need to know for the upcoming election, check out the NevadaIndependent.com.
Still so impressed with Joey Lovato's job on that explainer video. Mr. Bice, I'm wondering though, even after watching that, this is somewhat complex to the average voter, even to maybe even some sophisticated voters. Dramatic change to how elections are done in Nevada, even though it exists in other states and a lot of municipal jurisdictions. Why do we need this?
Well, John, we need this, and and question 3 is proposed because the current closed partisan primary system excludes a third, actually a little over a third, of registered voters in the state of Nevada from participating in the primaries. And that is, I mean, you do the math, it's about 600,000 registered voters. These are not people that are just citizens. They're actually registered to vote and they aren't allowed to vote. And it's not that unique. We actually do this in the state of Nevada already. If you think about it, you know, we have 3 branches of government, the executive, the legislative, and the judicial. For the judicial branch of government, we already have open primaries. Those voters show up at the polls. Doesn't matter whether they're registered Rs, registered Ds, registered independents, or any party that they want to belong to. And they get to vote in those primaries, and they get to decide then who ought to proceed into the general election. So you have the full citizenry is heard in those elections. The problem right now is for the legislative and executive branch elections, that broad citizenry isn't heard. It's actually excluded.
So those are nonpartisan races, but we can, that you're referring to in terms of why the entire electorate participates. But that's open primaries, and we can talk more about that in a second. What about the ranked choice voting part of it, which is a dramatic change?
So the ranking process, John, just allows voters more choice, more voice in terms of when you get to the general. The way it works is they get to prioritize the candidates from first to last. There will be top 5 that move out of the primary into the general. And then the voters are allowed to express their preference for these voters. We as citizens exercise our preferences every day to make sure that we maximize our choices. Whether it's, you know, I go to the pizza parlor and I want sausage, and they say, well, you can't have sausage. Well, then I go to my next preference, and so on and so forth. And all it does is maximizes the opportunity for the voters to express their preferences, so that when someone is elected, they actually have to have a true majority of support of all voters, as opposed to the very small partisan primary voters that currently have an oversized say in the system. Because what happens is, in these elections, John, and you know this better than I do, you end up with as little as 10% of the electorate actually deciding who these representatives are.
What is your second choice on pizza, just so we have that on the record?
That'd be pepperoni.
Okay. Elizabeth.
Mr. Bice, I imagine you have some words to say, and excuse me, Mr. Schrager, you have words to say in response.
Say 2 in a row.
Mr. Bice has had, he got his time. Go right ahead.
Yeah. Well, let's not understate how dramatic a change this would be in the way elections are conducted here in Nevada for the vast majority of offices. It's going to be a tremendous change. I don't see that the reasons that my colleague has laid out are sufficient, really, to push us to put this sort of alteration in our Constitution on a near permanent basis. It's very hard to change the Constitution. So if there's a problem with this, it's going to be very difficult for anyone to back out of it. That's the number one thing. But I also want to say, in response to the nonpartisan issue, let's not act as if nonpartisans, people who have chosen to register as nonpartisan, are some group that's being discriminated against. 2/3 of Nevadans belong to political parties, and no one's polled them, as far as I know, and asked them whether or not they want people who aren't part of their party to be deciding who their nominees are. And in fact, this would do away with nominees from parties. One thing we're not talking about in this entire discussion so far up to now is that this is, in some ways, an attack on political parties. Now, that's fine. Someone can say, I don't agree with political parties as a way of organizing politics or conducting political action. That's fine, but that should be up front. I also think that there's a false premise going around that this is going to somehow be favorable to third parties or to minor parties. My own particular view is this going to destroy minor parties and independent groups. There's simply no way that those groups, as currently constituted, are going to be able to play in the money game that is politics and elections as they stand right now. You're not going to have 5 different groups putting up people in the fall. You're going to have 3 Republicans and 2 Democrats, or 3 Democrats and 2 Republicans. You're going to have more of the same as opposed to voice being spread out. So, the sort of claims that are being made on behalf of nonpartisan voters who have chosen to be nonpartisan, maybe they don't want to involve themselves in primaries. Those claims, I don't think, are borne out by the evidence, and I think it's highly speculative for us to be saying this is going to solve any of the problems Mr. Bice is talking about in any prompt or even real way ever.
So let me and if there's anything there you want to respond to, that's fine, Mr. Bice. But let me put up on the screen for folks to see a part of a column that was written by a gentleman who's long observed politics, especially up north, by the name of Stanley Power. Here's what he said. In sum, ranked choice voting is a Trojan horse amidst Nevada's efficient electoral system, which has served Nevadans well for more than 160 years, ever since its election laws were formulated. An old saw still applies. If it ain't broke, don't try to fix it. RCV, that's ranked choice voting, remains a solution in search of a problem, for it creates a needless complexity that makes voting less, not more, accessible. So I guess what I'm wondering about, and I alluded to this in the first question I asked, why do we need this? And let me just follow up by saying I follow politics in this state for a long time, as both of you know, as all of you know. And yes, it's taken a toll on me. But seriously, we generally have not elected crazy people to office, which is not so much at the major level. Governor, U.S. Senator. We elect moderates anyhow, and this is supposed to get rid of the extremes. If it ain't broke, don't fix it.
Well, John, I know that you talk to a lot of the voters out there. You've been here about as long, or probably a little longer than I have in this state, and I've been involved in the legal aspect of politics, not the political aspect like you. But if you talk to voters out there, and I have talked to voters, and you actually talk to candidates out there, they believe that the system is broken. They believe that the system, by excluding some 600,000 registered voters in this state, you end up with a system where this small, tiny portion of the electorate, which tends to be the most partisan, who participate in the partisan primaries, end up choosing the candidate. And so by the time they get to the general election, guess what's happened? Most voters have had virtually no say in who those candidates are. So they show up, and then the two major parties give the electorate a take it or leave it choice, which of course, for the partisan parties, they like that. They want to leave the voters with a take it or leave it choice. This, by opening the primaries up and then doing the ranking so that voters can express their preferences, that's going to allow voters to have the say. They'll have 5 candidates in the general, and then they can rank them in order of preference. And if you think about who a voter is, or I'm sorry, if you think about candidates today, and I know you know a lot of representatives and candidates, off the record, John, what do they tell you? They tell you they know that certain legislation or certain things would be good for the state and good for the total electorate, but they also then tell you in confidence, but I can't support it because I'll get primaried. And that happens all the time during our legislature and in Congress and at all levels of government.
So I'm going to let Elizabeth jump in again in a second. I am curious how you're privy to my off-the-record conversation. That's pretty close. That's pretty close. But what about the argument that Mr. Schrager makes, and I'll amplify a little bit. Listen, if you're registered nonpartisan, you want to participate in the Democratic primary or Republican primary, it's very easy to switch your registration. You can go do that. And why shouldn't political parties be able to choose their nominees in a primary unfettered from an invasion of people who have decided not to register with that party?
John, they are free to choose their nominee. But what they're not free to do is use a state function paid for by the taxpayers, which is what primary elections are. Those are state action. And what they're doing is they're closing that state action to a wide swath of the electorate. They're using taxpayer money for their nominating process. They can use any nominating process they want at their expense, but it's inappropriate. And by the way, the U.S. Supreme Court has addressed this in a Washington state case where the partisan parties tried to claim that they had a right of association so that people shouldn't be allowed to vote in the primaries. And the Supreme Court outright rejected that because these are state functions. All voters should be allowed to participate. And if the political parties, the partisan parties, want to have a nominating process, they're free to do that. The Democrats in this state have used a caucus in the past, as you well know. There's no entitlement to use state-funded elections and then use those as a weapon to bar voters from voting. And people, by the way, nonpartisan voters, they've chosen not to belong to the two major parties, right? And people are telling them, well, you should have to join one of the parties in order to participate in the election. That's wrong. And we can change that, and that's what question 3 is going to do.
So I have a separate question, but I really want Mr. Schrager's opinion on what Mr. Bice referred to, which is that right now in Nevada, the parties do nominate through a caucus process, and it does work similarly to ranked choice voting. So if it's good enough for the parties on a nominating level, why is it not good enough for the public?
Yeah, you're referring to the 2020 Democratic Caucus, right? So it's happened one time. And as someone who participated in the structuring of that and the carrying out of that, I cannot recommend it for the nominating of a presidential nominee. I also absolutely cannot recommend it, having had experience with it, for any other statewide or legislative office in Nevada. It was an absolute nightmare. Now, we were forced to do that largely because of the way caucuses are structured. They are different than elections. Elections so far in Nevada and most of the country, you get a plurality and you win the election. Caucuses, from time immemorial, had to have thresholds and rankings. And it was done in the way it was because there was all of the complaints about day-long caucuses and how difficult and problematic it was. So having tried this, now, as you know, we are getting rid of caucuses entirely. One of the reasons was it became practically impossible and very unpopular. I'm not saying that's the absolute destiny of this scheme as well, but it certainly, if there's any educational value in that, was that it was a dismal failure. But I do want to go back to something Mr. Bice said a moment ago about partisanship, and that somehow this is going to speak to partisanship. This is going to reduce partisanship. I don't think that's true at all. At least it hasn't been borne out. Look, if we were the 27th state to be considering this, and there were hundreds of elections and thousands of individual races from which we could draw data that could tell us how campaigns and electors and politics was going to play out under this system, we would have a lot more to talk about. Right now, as I understand it, as I've always understood it, politics is the clash of interests to produce policy results, right? That's not going to change, and it's certainly not going to change because you have open primaries or ranked choice voting. That is the nature of political conflict. That's going to continue. And if there's 3 Democrats and 2 Republicans, they're all going to be acting as aggressively and pushing forward with their platforms as they do now. And in fact, this ranked choice voting isn't going to produce better candidates, as far as I can tell. It's certainly going to produce more of them. And the cost of participating in electoral politics is going to skyrocket. Can you imagine? Can you imagine if Governor Lombardo and Sheriff Lombardo and Governor Sisolak had to face off twice? If Senator Cortez Masto and Adam Laxalt had to face off twice, their consultants aren't going to say, well, it's good enough, just get me in the top 5 so I can go to the fall. Because their success in the, quote, open primary is going to lead to more money and more credibility. And this is going to, if anyone thinks this is going to mean less mail in your mailbox, if anyone thinks this is going to mean fewer commercials crowding your airways every single night, the evidence simply doesn't bear that out. This is more politics. Now, you may say that's great, that's fine. We want more politics, we want more speech. There is nothing in this that demonstrates to me that the quality of that speech or that political participation is going to improve.
Can you go into a little more detail about, you called the Democratic Presidential Nominating Caucus a disaster. Explain for us, why was it a disaster? What happened? Why do you characterize it that way?
You know, it's the complexities of ranked choice voting, especially the first few times people are doing it. It is an unfamiliar process. And so the number of spoiled ballots or confusingly cast ballots was far beyond anything we had seen before. And that's going to be true here. In fact, I'm sure at some point we're going to get to the recent Alaska primary. That's the most recent and most obvious example of ranked choice voting. Well, you know, anytime you make registration more difficult, people are going to have a harder time registering. Anytime you make accessibility to the polls more difficult, people are going to have a hard time getting to polls. Anytime you make the act of casting a ballot more complex, you are going to have impacts that historically have been disproportionately felt by racial, ethnic, and language minorities and economically disadvantaged groups. Now, in Alaska, 8% of the ballots were thrown out because of something having to do, this is all public record.
That's not true.
8% of the ballots had to be thrown out because of, something to do with overvotes, undervotes, exhausted ballots because they didn't vote for enough people. And there were only 3 people on the ballot. So, translating that to Nevada's recent election, that's 112,000 ballots.
So I'm going to stay on this topic, and Mr. Bice, you're going to get your opportunity. So this topic has been much in the media, much in the public eye and dialogue, at least in the past couple of months. Joe Gloria, who is the registrar of voters here in Clark County, said in an interview with the Review Journal just earlier this month, and I'll quote, we're going to bring the slide up on the screen, I hope, for the audience to see. But Joe Gloria said, "We don't give the general public enough credit. They learn." Mr. Bice.
Right? They do learn, and the rationale, we're hearing this parade of alleged horribles, which aren't really real, to justify excluding all these voters in Nevada because the partisan parties want to control the process, and they want to exclude voters. He talks about a few votes up in Alaska. He's actually got the statistics way wrong. The number of people that allegedly had their ballots excluded because they, quote, made an error on the ballot, I believe the number I saw from the state of Alaska was 0.02%. It was a very, very small number. And ironically, they're using things like that to justify excluding 600,000 registered voters in the state of Nevada from having a legitimate say in who their candidates ought to be for these offices that impact these voters. Open the system up, which is what question 3 does, so that all people, all registered voters can participate in the process and have a voice in who they want to hold that office. And by doing that, you're going to attract candidates. Think about that for a minute. John, you know a lot of candidates in this state. You know a lot of people in this state. How many people who you know would be a good representative have told you, I'm not doing that. I'm not putting my family through that. I'm not going to run in these partisan primaries where I have to pander to the narrow focus base and debase myself in order to do so. We have good candidates now, I agree, but we have a lot more good candidates and better candidates with a system that is open, where they can participate and they don't have to pander to the base, and they don't have to pander to the base in a closed primary and then try and move more to the middle during the general election, which then results in what? Voters calling them flip-floppers and two-faced. The system right now is the problem. The selection process, it forces these candidates into taking these positions that are inconsistent with what the true majority of voters want. And question 3, by opening it up and then allowing the voters to rank these candidates, the candidates will now have to do what? They don't pander to the base. They actually have to get a true majority support. And by getting true majority support, the voters then have had their say. And they'll have confidence in the system, and there'll be greater participation in the system because the voters will believe, hey, you know what, I now have a voice. Because right now, if you talk to them, they think, I don't have a voice. Why am I gonna waste my time and go participate in this civic process?
So, Mr. Schrager, the essence of what Mr. Bice is saying, I think, is borne out that people are upset with the process now. They're upset with either the candidates and even candidates are upset with the process having to pander to the base. Let me show you what our own Michael Schaus at the Independent wrote about this. Debates about whether ranked choice voting would actually do anything to temper partisan divides, let alone whether it would be a workable reform, are worth exploring. However, the mere fact that such a proposal has become a serious ballot proposal in a state where non-major party voters are the single largest voting bloc is in and of itself an indication that such divides are becoming too much for many to endure. So, Mr. Schrager, I know you're not going to argue with the premise that on both sides, candidates in primaries pander to the base because low turnout, the base is generally going to turn out. And I haven't even heard you make the argument that Joe Gloria pushed back against, which is that voters can't learn. If this goes on and on and on, voters will learn how to use it. So I guess what I'm wondering is, do you even acknowledge that there's a problem that needs to be fixed?
I would not acknowledge that this is the solution.
No, that's not what I asked, though. That's not what I asked, though.
Look,
that may be true.
No, you're talking about a problem in the public sphere. Are there problems in our public sphere? Absolutely there are. Misinformation, voter suppression, outright lying. This doesn't fix any of those things. You see, something that makes me very uncomfortable, personally, is anytime people say, I know what the people want and here's how I'm going to fix it. But beyond that, and your columnist also makes this point, I get very uncomfortable with these behavioralist arguments, right? That if I make these particular changes in the structure, the behavior of an entire society will be moderated, will be mediated, will be changed, right? That makes me very uncomfortable, especially when it's coming from, we haven't gotten to this, right? This is not some thing that's coming into this state by popular demand. There's no groundswell of people saying we need open primaries or ranked choice voting. Right? This is a particular project of extremely wealthy people who ain't from around here, who are importing it into Nevada for particular purposes. And we can get into those purposes, and I'd be happy to do so. The point is, these are people who would never say, you know what, let's use the tax code to change people's behavior. Let's use the regulatory code to change corporations' behavior to a way that I think is better, right? But yet somehow this is going to modify the conduct of candidates and parties and the electorate in a way that these folks think is better. But what they're saying is, Mr. Bice a couple times now has said, we're going to force a majority to elect. That's not really what this is. What it is saying that as a vision of consensus, it is better for everyone's third or fourth choice to be elected than it is for 42% to have their first choice elected. Now, look, you can agree with that or disagree with that. That's fine. But you cannot tell me that there is the potential over time when the third or fourth choice keeps getting elected, that there isn't going to be frustration on the parts of the electorate. So, there is no way right now, I'm not going to say this will contribute to dissatisfaction with democratic processes, but no one up here and no one anywhere else can assure me that it won't. That over time, the buildup of frustration with the third choice always winning isn't going to be problematic, because I think it is.
So, Elizabeth, I have to tell you, I've known Mr. Bice for some time, and I saw these looks come across his face while Bradley Schrager was talking of puzzlement
I get that a lot.
and shaking his head. Why is that, Mr. Bice?
Well, John, because we're just hearing the partisan talking points. Let's try and dissuade voters from divesting the partisan power brokers from their throne right now. That's what all those arguments are about. And he says that this is something that's being brought here. There's no demand for it. John, you talk to a lot of people in this state. So do I. There is significant demand. We raised 250,000 signatures for this initiative, John. That's one of the highest amounts of signature gathering in the history of this state's initiative process. Why do you think that those voters supported it? And they're registered voters? Because they recognize that this current partisan system, where these candidates have to pander to a small base, and then that small base can be as little as even under 10% are actually choosing the candidates that then appear in the general election
But a
ballot.
lot of petitions are qualified with a number of signatures by either the truth or some variation of the truth to persuade voters. What Mr. Schrager is referring to, just so the audience knows, Elizabeth, is there are out-of-state interests. There are some billionaires who have been involved in trying to get this passed in a variety of states. And now there's a huge TV buy on behalf of question 3. That didn't come from those voters. That came from out-of-state folks. Now, I'm not saying that negates the arguments for RCV, but he's right about that.
Mr. Bice, can I tack on, and
Sure.
then I really want to hear what you have to say?
Go ahead.
Granted, there's been out-of-state support and money. I've also been quite surprised by the coalition of in-state groups who have stepped up with major amounts of money. Can you just kind of rattle those off for everyone who's listening so we know who's got a stake in this game?
So I'm actually reluctant because I don't want to be like at the Academy Awards where I omit somebody's name. Elizabeth, I'm going to actually pass on the opportunity to name names.
Okay.
But I will say this, we have a lot of support both in state and out of state, and we acknowledge that. In fact, we disclose every donor on our campaign list, so you all know who they are. That's how you are aware of all the support, the broad support, whether it's from unions, whether it's from state employees and teachers and the like, and including gaming companies. A lot of the state's employers are backing this, and they're backing it because they recognize what the voters are recognizing. And of course, they have no say in the signing of the petition. So those 250,000 voters here that signed, because they wanted to see this on the ballot and have a chance to vote for it. But resources are just that. They're resources, right? Whether they come from in-state or out of state. They don't get a vote. I mean, that's the good thing about our constitutional amendment process. Every citizen has just one vote. So whether the out-of-state donors, they don't have any vote in whether or not the voters want to approve this. It's the people of Nevada get to look at the question and decide, do I want a right, which is what the question presents, question 3 presents. Do I want a right to participate in primaries that then also grants me the right to then rank the candidates in my order of preference? And once you present that question to the voters, and John's, your team's done polling on this, voters are in favor of that because they recognize what it will do for them, not for the partisan parties, I understand, but the partisan parties are invested in the current system, so they oppose it. I understand that. But that's why the voters should support this.
So speaking of constitutional tenets, which you both, Mr. Schrager alluded to it and you outright said it, one of the better arguments I've read against this proposal came out of Reason Foundation. Reason is a libertarian organization, and they have a foundation arm and a media arm, just for those watching who don't know. So I'd like to bring up the slide on the screen. I'm going to read what Reason wrote. Regarding open primaries, political parties are fundamentally private organizations with the right to set their own rules for nominating candidates. To infringe on that right is to violate the freedom of association. No matter how large or powerful the two major parties may be, the government has no role in determining the process for their primary elections. What's your response?
The U.S. Supreme Court has said the exact opposite. The U.S. Supreme Court has ruled that is absolutely wrong because primary elections are a state process. If they would like to if the partisan parties want to conduct their own elections, they're free to do that at their expense. But what they're not free to do is talk about violating the right of association. You're telling people that in order to participate in a state process, you must join one of the major partisan parties in this state in order to exercise your franchise to vote. That's why the courts have said that argument is flat wrong.
Well, then you could have filed a lawsuit, and you could have saved your friends $20 million. But instead, here we are.
I believe we won the lawsuit, actually. You filed
in the midst of a political campaign. No, you could have outlawed closed primaries if you thought that was the way to go. Would have been much, much cheaper. Wouldn't have dragged us through all of this. But here we are, spending $20 million to get this thing through. And I just, my reaction to that is a bit of astonishment, which is we find ourselves in a moment of acute crisis of democracy in this country. I don't think anyone can deny that. And if you have $20 million, and I will take on faith that these are people of goodwill, these wealthy backers. These are people of goodwill who want to improve political society. What I'm sort of astonished at is that this is what they chose to do with it. They're not choosing to fight voter suppression. They're not choosing to fight misinformation. This is the hill they've not only chosen to fight on, they actually built the hill. Nobody went to them and said, please come here and do this. This is how they've chosen to spend this money in politics. And to me, that just, as a matter of common sense, that seems to me to be sort of whistling through a graveyard that is itself on fire.
That's an interesting argument. We actually are fighting voter suppression. That's because 600,000 registered voters in the state of Nevada are excluded from this process. And the partisan parties want it that way, And that's what we're fighting. It's ironic he talks about litigation because they sued us to stop this. They then, and lost at both the district court
Who
and
is
at the
they?
Nevada Supreme
Who is
Court.
they? Let's be clear on this.
That's a good question, John. You'd have to ask them because they really don't tell anybody who they are. But Mr. Schrager and his, one of the high-powered DC law firms, again, I'm sure they were very concerned about Nevada voters, came into the state, filed a lawsuit trying to stop voters from being able to hear this. Once the courts rejected that, they then spent millions of dollars trying to interfere with the signature gathering process and discourage voters from putting this on the ballot. So when we talk about who's trying to advance the interests of Nevada voters, I mean, they sued me personally. I wear it like a badge of pride that they tried to bar voters from having their say.
I think we can, we have to wrap this up, Elizabeth, but I think we can at least agree here tonight that Bradley Schrager is himself a high-powered lawyer. Would you
One of the highest. I agree. I wasn't trying to diminish him by referencing his DC colleagues.
I'm kidding. So, gentlemen,
No offense.
gentlemen, I really do appreciate having this high-level discussion. This is a very important topic. I hope voters will get educated on this. There's a lot of stuff on the Independence site as well. Bradley Schrager and Todd Bice, really appreciate your being here.
Thanks for having me.
Always a pleasure, Elizabeth. So stick around. A lot more coming at Indyfest. Next up, we're going to do something on the state of the cannabis industry. And after watching this, I bet a lot of people would like some of that. Stick around.